You ever notice how small towns always feel different on Halloween night? Not just because of the costumes or the kids running door to door with pillowcases, but something deeper, like the streets themselves remember. Every creak in a fence, every gust of wind through the hedges, it all feels heavier, almost like the air is watching you. Dalkeith, a little town just outside Edinburgh, was no different. People called it a quiet, working-class kind of place. The kind of town where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. But in 2003, that illusion of safety cracked. And it cracked on Halloween. Now, before I go further, let me tell you, this isn't just a ghost story. It's a true story. A real girl, 14 years old, named Jodi Jones, who left her house one evening and never came back. And if you're listening right now, if you're in your room with the lights dimmed, I need you to picture this. A narrow path through thick woods, an old stone wall covered in moss, and the echo of footsteps crunching on damp leaves. Because that's where Jodi's story begins to turn dark. The evening had started out normal. Jodi had plans, like most teenagers. She wanted to meet her boyfriend, a 16-year-old named Luke Mitchell. To her family, Luke was complicated. He was the kind of kid who walked around in a long trench coat, who idolized Kurt Cobain, who carved out his own identity like a statement against the town itself. To Jodi, though, he was everything. A first love, a secret rebellion, someone who made her feel like she wasn't just another girl in Dalkeith. Around dinner time, Jodi told her mom she was stepping out. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Parents in Dalkeith let their kids roam. This wasn't a city, after all. And besides, it was Halloween. There were other teens out in the streets, people laughing, families carving pumpkins. The idea of something terrible happening? No one thought that way. But when hours passed and Jodi didn't return, that silence started to burn. Her mom's unease turned into panic. Calls were made, friends were asked, and soon the town itself began to shift. Neighbors leaving their homes, flashlights in hand, walking through the night searching for a girl who should have been home hours ago. Now, here's where the story takes on that chill. Because the search didn't lead them to a friend's house, or to a party, or even wandering the streets. No, Jodi's sister, along with some friends, followed a path near New Battle Abbey, a wooded area where kids often cut through to save time. And in that darkness, just past the crumbling stone wall, they found her. But let's not get there yet. Not just yet. I want you to imagine being 14 again. Imagine the thrill of sneaking out to see someone you weren't supposed to, of walking down a hidden path while your heart beat fast, not from fear, but from excitement. That was Jodi that night. Just a girl, with her whole life ahead of her, stepping into the shadows for what she thought would be another night of teenage freedom. Except something was waiting for her there. You ever hear the way the wind sounds when it shifts through trees at night? It doesn't just move the branches, it whispers. It almost sounds like voices if you're alone long enough. And the path Jodi walked that night was lined with tall trees, their leaves slick with rain, their roots breaking through the dirt like skeletal hands. It wasn't the kind of place you wanted to be after dark, especially not alone. But it was also the perfect place for someone who didn't want to be seen. When Jodi's sister and the others stumbled upon her body later that night, the scene was so brutal, so out of place in their quiet Scottish town, that most people refused to believe it at first. Her life had been cut short in the most violent way imaginable, and it happened on a night where the line between fun and fear was already thin. Halloween. And the thing is, Halloween in Dalkeith had always been a harmless holiday. Kids went trick-or-treating, teens lit bonfires, neighbors drank and laughed. But after 2003, after Jodi's murder, Halloween in that town would never feel the same again. It wasn't costumes and candy anymore, it was a reminder. A reminder of how quickly darkness can step out from behind the trees and take someone away. This is just the beginning. Because what happened after, the investigation, the whispers, the accusations, would tear Dalkeith apart. And it all began with a girl walking down a path on Halloween night. Now tell me, would you have walked down that path alone? The search started out almost casually, the way it always does in small towns. At first, people reassured themselves, she's just at a friend's house, she's fine. They told each other Jodi had probably lost track of time. Maybe she was walking home slowly. Maybe she had gone to see Luke and forgot to call. But as the night grew colder and the hours stretched on, that casual reassurance turned brittle. Every unanswered ring of the phone carried a sharp edge. Every shadow outside the window seemed to linger a little too long. Parents know when something is wrong. It's a kind of primal instinct that creeps into their stomach and won't let go. By the time midnight approached, that instinct was screaming. Groups began to form. Neighbors, friends, classmates. Flashlights flicked on, beams slicing through the October dark. Some carried dogs on leashes, others just walked, their shoes crunching over wet leaves, calling Jodi's name into the silence. It was a clear night, the kind of cold Scottish night where your breath lingers in the air, but the stars were hidden behind thick clouds. Everything below those clouds felt muted. Even the moon seemed unwilling to watch. The group that mattered most, the one that would stumble across something no one wanted to see, was led by Jodi's sister, Janine. She was only a little older than Jodi, but that night, she carried the heavy weight of both panic and responsibility. With her were her boyfriend and another friend. They decided to search near New Battle Abbey, a place where teenagers often hung out, smoked, or just cut through as a shortcut. The path they took was known locally as the V's, named for the shape the walls and trees seemed to form as you went deeper in. It was one of those places that looked different in daylight, quiet, even beautiful, but under the cover of night, it transformed. The trees grew into towering figures, black silhouettes pressing in closer the further you went. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and moss. Each step echoed, amplified by the silence around them. Janine's flashlight beam danced nervously across the path, bouncing off the crumbling stone wall that lined the route. Every crack in the stone seemed to grin back at her. The branches above swayed with the wind, and each time they did, they sent a wave of shadows crawling along the dirt. "Jodi," she called out. Her voice cracked, swallowed almost instantly by the trees. There was no reply, only the sound of their footsteps and the faint rustle of leaves shifting somewhere deeper in the woods. They pressed on. About halfway down the path, the air seemed to change. That's something people who were there described later, how the atmosphere shifted, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The group moved slower now, their flashlights sweeping back and forth, searching for any sign, a jacket, a bag, anything. And then one of them spotted it, a scrap of cloth, torn, snagged on a branch. The beam of the flashlight froze on it, and silence fell over the group. No one wanted to say what they were thinking, but they didn't have to. They all knew. Janine's hand shook as she reached for it. The fabric was familiar, too familiar. They kept moving, hearts pounding harder with every step. And that's when the smell hit them. A sharp, metallic tang in the air that cut through the earthy scent of wet leaves. It's a smell you never forget once you recognize it. Blood. The beam of the flashlight trembled as it moved forward. That's when they saw her. At first, it didn't register. The human mind doesn't want to process something so brutal, not right away. Jodi's body lay hidden by the wall, slumped in the grass and leaves, her form twisted unnaturally. Her throat, God, her throat had been cut so deep it was almost unspeakable. The violence of it didn't belong in their quiet town, didn't belong in any world they knew. Janine froze. Her scream never quite formed. It came out instead as a broken sob, jagged and raw. Her boyfriend grabbed her, tried to pull her back, but she couldn't take her eyes off what lay in front of her. They had found Jodi. But this wasn't the Jodi who had laughed at the dinner table, who had planned her future, who had rushed out the door with teenage excitement. This was something else. Something ruined. The flashlights shook wildly as they turned away, fumbling for their phones, their voices colliding in a panic of sobs and shouts. The forest, which had been silent only moments ago, now seemed alive with their terror, amplifying every sound, mocking their cries as they echoed off the stone walls. That moment, the moment Jodi's sister found her, would haunt Dalkeith forever. And here's the part that sticks with me. Halloween is supposed to be about pretend horror, about masks and jump scares and stories you can laugh off once the lights come back on. But for the people who were there that night, for Janine, for her mother, for the neighbors who heard the news, Halloween became something else entirely. It became real. And once horror is real, it doesn't fade. It lingers. By the time police arrived, the path was already crowded. Not with people, at least not yet, but with the weight of disbelief. Jodi's sister sat trembling on the grass, her boyfriend trying to comfort her, though his own face looked gray, hollow. Flashlights still flickered across the scene, cutting through the shadows like frantic, searching eyes. The officers moved cautiously, their boots sinking into the damp earth, their radios crackling with clipped, urgent voices. For them, this wasn't just a missing girl anymore. This was a crime scene, and it was messy. They told everyone to step back, to leave the path. But here's the truth about small towns: boundaries don't hold. Even as the police tried to seal it off, word spread like wildfire. By morning, Dalkeith wasn't just whispering, it was buzzing, crackling with rumors, fear, and morbid curiosity. The scene itself was devastating. Jodi's body had been left exposed, discarded almost, and the sheer violence of the attack made even seasoned officers shift uncomfortably. One officer later admitted he had to look away for a moment, steady his breathing, before he could continue documenting the scene. Another said the silence in the woods that night didn't feel natural. It felt heavy, as if the forest itself knew something awful had just happened. News crews were quick to descend. By the next day, cameras pointed at the Abbey path. Reporters stood under umbrellas describing a brutal and shocking murder in a town where nothing like this had ever happened. Strangers watched from their windows as vans rolled in, lights flashing, equipment being set up like a stage for something grotesque. The path that had been a shortcut for teenagers, a simple strip of earth between trees, had turned into the most infamous place in Midlothian. The media didn't just report, they consumed. They dissected Jodi's life, her friends, her family, her choices. Headlines screamed her name, plastered her face across front pages, while neighbors quietly murmured, wondering who could do such a thing. It wasn't long before suspicion began to bleed into the air, thick as the October fog. In towns like Dalkeith, people know each other, or at least they think they do. But when something like this happens, that familiarity curdles into doubt. Suddenly, every neighbor looks different. Every friend has a shadow behind their smile. People started asking questions they never thought they'd ask about each other. Could it have been someone local? Someone they saw every day? And the whispers came fast. Some pointed fingers at strangers, others at boys Jodi had known. One name rose quicker than the rest, Luke Mitchell. Luke was Jodi's boyfriend. He was just 14, the same age as her. On paper, it should have been innocent. Two teenagers caught up in the whirlwind of young love. But in small towns, stories grow faster than facts. People began describing him as dark, brooding, obsessed with gothic music, with Marilyn Manson posters on his walls. They said he smoked weed, skipped school, had a rebellious streak. It was enough to make people wonder, enough to let suspicion creep in. The police noticed too. They interviewed Luke, examined his alibi, combed through his belongings. He said he hadn't seen Jodi that night, that he was at home. His mother backed him up. But already the narrative was building. In the public eye, Luke wasn't just a teenager anymore. He was a character in a horror story, cast as the villain before the final act had even played out. Meanwhile, Jodi's funeral was planned. Hundreds attended, the pews packed, tears spilling over as friends and family clung to each other. Outside, cameras flashed, reporters shoved microphones into grieving faces, trying to squeeze tragedy into sound bites. The church bells tolled, but if you ask some who were there, they'll tell you it didn't sound like mourning. It sounded like an alarm. Because here's the thing about a murder in a small town. It doesn't stay contained. It ripples outward, infecting every conversation, every look, every late-night walk home. Parents wouldn't let their kids out after dark. Teachers noticed silence in classrooms, eyes staring off, still trying to process what had happened. And in the back of everyone's mind was the same unspoken question. Was the killer still here, walking among them? Dalkeith didn't feel safe anymore. The forest didn't feel like just a forest. And Halloween, which had been just days away, now hung like a curse over the town. Because horror had arrived. And it wasn't going anywhere. Police had their eyes set on Luke Mitchell. At first glance, he seemed like any other teenager trying to push boundaries, carving out his own identity. But the officers saw something else. They saw contradictions. They saw opportunity. And in a case this brutal, with a town demanding answers, contradictions are everything. Luke said he'd been at home cooking dinner the night Jodi died. His mother backed him up. But the timeline was thin, slippery, and the detectives knew it. They asked themselves, how could a 14-year-old boy commit a crime so savage? And yet, how could they ignore the storm of rumors swirling around him? People talked about his fascination with darkness, his Marilyn Manson posters, his notebooks filled with scribbles that looked, to outsiders, like something sinister. He was quiet, withdrawn, someone who didn't quite fit the clean-cut mold the town liked to imagine for its children. In the harsh light of tragedy, those quirks became evidence in the court of public opinion. But the police needed more than whispers. They searched his room. They seized his clothes, his shoes, his belongings. They scoured the Abbey path for anything, a trace of blood, a strand of hair, a footprint that could place him there. And in the meantime, the community was already drawing their own conclusions. It's strange, isn't it? How quickly fear can transform into certainty. The townspeople wanted a name, a face to attach their horror to. And Luke's image, pale and sullen, became the one they latched onto. People stopped meeting his eyes in the street. His family began to feel the isolation, the cold shoulders, the pointed stares. In a way, they were all being tried right alongside him. Yet, despite the growing suspicion, the case was still fragile. Evidence was circumstantial, the narrative shaky. The truth is, the brutality of Jodi's murder didn't fit neatly into a teenager's profile. Investigators argued behind closed doors, weighing what little they had against the tidal wave of community anger. Some believed Luke had to be involved. Others wondered if focusing on him too hard meant missing something else, someone else. But the longer the investigation dragged on, the worse the pressure became. Newspapers printed his name alongside Jodi's, their stories forever linked. Reporters highlighted his gothic persona, his taste in music, as if that were proof enough of something darker lurking inside. And slowly, the public stopped asking whether Luke did it. They began asking when he'd be arrested. For Luke himself, the walls closed in fast. He was only 14, but the world around him was turning monstrous. Neighbors avoided him. His friends shrank back. His every movement was watched, dissected, judged. Imagine that, being a child, and yet being treated like a killer in your own community. And through it all, the Abbey path sat silent. The leaves fell, the trees stood tall, but that strip of dirt had become a scar on Dalkeith. People still passed by, but they didn't walk it. They hurried past it. They avoided its shadows. Because even though police tape had been cleared away, the memory of what was found there lingered like a stain that could never be washed clean. As October slipped further into autumn, Dalkeith wasn't just mourning Jodi anymore. It was watching itself transform. Fear, suspicion, judgment, they were spreading through the town like rot. And the question wasn't just who killed Jodi Jones. It was whether the truth would ever cut through the fog of what people wanted to believe. By winter, Dalkeith wasn't just a town in mourning, it was a stage. And every stage needs a villain. Luke Mitchell, barely 15 now, became the centerpiece of the story. The media had branded him. The police had focused on him. And the town had all but convicted him before a trial had even been set. That's the thing about horror in real life. It doesn't wait for the truth. It feeds on fear, on appearances, on the need for closure, even if closure means pointing at the nearest shadow and calling it a monster. The evidence, though, was thin. Painfully thin. There were no fingerprints tying him to the scene. No bloodstains found on his clothes. No weapon recovered with his prints. What the police did have were fragments, suggestions, coincidences, inconsistencies in his story. A witness claimed to have seen him near the path. A dog walker reported something unusual. Investigators pieced together a mosaic that didn't form a clear picture, but when desperation meets pressure, blurred lines can look convincing enough. And then there were the knives. Luke owned them, big ones, sharp ones, the kind of thing you could find in the drawer of any teenager fascinated by rebellion and image. To his friends, it was posturing. To the public, it was sinister. It didn't matter that countless boys his age had the same obsessions. With Jodi's death so fresh, those knives became symbols. And symbols are dangerous. The trial didn't happen overnight. Months stretched into years. But with each passing season, the legend of Luke Mitchell grew. Some parents told their children not to talk to him. Others whispered stories that painted him darker with every retelling. He was described as obsessed, controlling, jealous. Someone who wrote strange things in his notebooks. Someone who loved violent music. All of it stacked up, brick by brick, until it resembled something like a case, even if the foundation was shaky. But here's the truth. The most haunting part of this story isn't the murder itself. It's how quickly the lines between fact and fear blurred. Reporters swarmed the courthouse, splashing headlines that made Luke out to be a gothic villain plucked straight from a horror movie. The public devoured every detail, no matter how flimsy, because they wanted the story to make sense. They needed it to make sense. Meanwhile, Luke himself walked through those days like a ghost. A teenager, pale and silent, sitting in interviews, sketching in notebooks, waiting for the world to decide what he was. Innocent? Guilty? It almost didn't matter. The monster had already been created in the public eye. Jodi's family, shattered and grieving, clung to the hope of justice. And who could blame them? Their daughter had been brutally taken from them. They needed an answer. But answers are dangerous things when they're forced, when they're sculpted from shadows rather than carved from truth. The town changed. Dalkeith's innocence, if it ever had any, was gone. Halloween passed quietly, uneasily, that year and the years after. Children didn't roam the streets the way they used to. Parents clutched their kids' hands a little tighter. And every time someone walked past the Abbey path, they quickened their steps, as if afraid the trees themselves might whisper what had happened there. Luke Mitchell wasn't in prison yet, but in the eyes of the people, he was already behind bars, locked in a cage made of suspicion and fear. And once a cage like that is built, it's almost impossible to break free. Because in the horror of real life, the scariest monsters aren't always found in the dark. Sometimes, they're the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the darkness. The courtroom in Edinburgh was old, echoing, and cold in a way that seeped into your bones. The kind of place where history pressed down on you, reminding everyone that lives had been weighed here before, and some had been broken by the verdict. Luke Mitchell sat there, no longer the boy from Dalkeith, but a symbol. The accused. His pale face framed by long hair, his eyes downward, sketching lines on paper when he wasn't staring into the middle distance. To the jury, he must have looked unreadable. To the press, he looked like a perfect villain. The prosecution wasted no time painting him as one. They spoke about obsession, about a controlling young boyfriend who couldn't handle rejection. They described Knives, his fascination with darkness, his love for Marilyn Manson. They spoke of jealousy, of anger boiling under the surface, of a teenager capable of something adults struggled to even imagine. But when it came to hard evidence, the kind that left no doubt, the room grew thinner. There were no fingerprints at the scene. No blood tied to him. Nothing placing him directly on the Abbey path that night. What the prosecution had was a puzzle built from suggestion, inference, rumor. And yet, laid out in the hushed weight of the courtroom, those pieces began to form a shape. The defense fought back. They reminded the jury that Luke was just a boy. 14. That knives and posters and music didn't make a murderer. They pointed out the gaps, the absence of DNA, the reliance on circumstantial details. But in that courtroom, logic struggled against fear, and fear was winning. Every testimony added layers to the story. Teachers spoke of Luke's behavior. Neighbors spoke of his habits. Friends whispered about arguments, about strange drawings. Each word stacked onto the growing tower of suspicion. And every time Luke looked up, the cameras caught it, freezing him in an expression that the tabloids could twist into menace. The gallery was packed. Reporters scribbled furiously. Family members wept quietly in the benches, Jodi's face framed in every article, every nightly broadcast. The town watched from living rooms, their televisions glowing like campfires telling a ghost story. But this ghost was real, and it was sitting in a chair just across from the jury. You could almost feel the air in that courtroom tighten as the days dragged on. Outside, protesters gathered, demanding justice for Jodi. Some held signs. Others shouted. The line between grief and anger blurred until it was a roar echoing through the courthouse walls. And through it all, Luke remained silent. He rarely spoke. He let his lawyers argue, let the narrative spin around him. But silence in a horror story is dangerous. Silence is a void, and people will always fill a void with the darkest thing they can imagine. The trial wasn't just about evidence anymore. It was about image, about perception, about a collective fear that needed release. Jodi had been brutally murdered, and someone had to pay. The town demanded it. The press demanded it. And the courtroom felt like it was tilting in that direction, inch by inch, as if the verdict had already been carved into stone before the gavel would fall. That's the danger of real-life horror. The line between justice and performance blurs. And when it blurs, the truth can get buried right alongside the victim. The boys eventually turned back, their footsteps echoing in the silence, and Jodi's mother collapsed into her chair, tears streaming down her face. The night stretched on, cruel and endless, with no sound but the occasional car in the distance and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. But then, just after midnight, a knock rattled the front door. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was urgent, uneven, almost frantic. When the door opened, the neighbors stood there pale-faced, their eyes wide, their voices lowered as though speaking too loudly would invite something into the house. They hadn't found Jodi. Not really. But they'd found something. The shortcut, the path Jodi had walked every single day, had revealed a secret that night. Beyond the broken wall, in the darkness under the trees, her body lay crumpled and twisted, hidden from sight except for the flicker of a shoe and the faint, sickening smell of iron in the air. It was so brutal, so violent, that no one could bring themselves to say the words out loud at first. They just stood there in the doorway, trembling, shaking their heads, whispering fragments. Not right, blood everywhere, can't be her. When the police arrived, their flashlights cut through the blackness of the woods like weak candles. The beams caught the pale curve of skin, the tangle of hair matted with blood, and the jagged lines carved across her. Jodi Jones hadn't just been killed, she had been butchered. Her throat slashed so deeply it was almost severed, her hands covered in defensive wounds, her body dragged, pulled into the underbrush. But there was something else, something the officers wouldn't forget. The scene felt staged. The violence seemed excessive, ritualistic, as though it wasn't only about killing, but about sending a message. Branches snapped underfoot as officers whispered to one another, the glow of their torches bouncing off the trees. Some swore they felt watched, as though something was still there in the shadows, crouched and waiting. The shortcut was suddenly no longer just a path between two neighborhoods. It became a wound in the landscape, a place that seemed to pulse with the violence that had erupted there. Even years later, locals would say they could never bring themselves to walk that way again, not even in daylight. Inside the house, Jodi's family received the news in silence, broken only by the sound of her mother's scream. A scream so sharp and raw that the neighbors swore they still remembered it decades later. It carried through the quiet streets of East Houses, chilling everyone who heard it, marking the moment when Halloween turned into horror for an entire town. And yet, something about the discovery left questions dangling in the cold night air. Because even as the police cordoned off the area, even as crime scene tape fluttered against the wind, whispers began to spread. Who could have done something like this? And more importantly, why there? Why then? Halloween week had already filled the town with ghost stories and talk of spirits walking among the living. Now the town of Dalkeith had a new story to whisper about, a story that wasn't a legend, but something very real, something with blood still staining the earth beneath the trees. And the most terrifying part? The killer wasn't a phantom. They were someone alive, breathing, moving among the town. Someone who had walked those same streets just hours earlier. Someone who, for all anyone knew, could be walking them still. The crime scene was chaos cloaked in silence. Police moved like shadows through the brush, their radios hissing in short bursts. Each beam of light revealed more horror. The jagged wounds on Jodi's neck, the scattering of her belongings, her jacket half torn, her bag tossed aside like it meant nothing, scraps of personal items caught in the roots and branches as if the woods themselves had tried to hold on to her last moments. The officers whispered to each other, their breath hanging in the night air. They were trained for this, of course, but some of them had never seen a body so mutilated, so deliberately brutalized. One constable swore he could smell copper and rot long before they even reached her, the metallic tang of blood heavy on the damp air. Another refused to walk back down that path alone after what he had seen. News spread quickly. By the next morning, the shortcut was infamous. Children who once ran through it to cut time to school now looked at the entrance like it was a mouth ready to swallow them whole. Parents dragged their kids the long way around, muttering about evil, about curses, about how nothing good ever happened near that old wall. Halloween decorations, still dangling from windows and lampposts, suddenly looked obscene. Plastic skeletons grinning while the real thing had taken place under the cover of leaves and branches. The police wasted no time bringing in detectives. They began interviewing neighbors, friends, and classmates. The town of Dalkeith was small enough that everyone knew everyone. And that made things even more terrifying, because if the killer wasn't some wandering stranger, then it had to be one of them. Officers asked about Jodi's last steps. Who had seen her alive? Who had walked that same path? Who had reason to want a 14-year-old girl dead? The questions rippled through the town like poisoned water, seeping into kitchens and schoolyards, living rooms and corner shops. Suspicion grew like a second shadow behind every glance. People whispered names, friends, boyfriends, ex-boyfriends, neighbors. Nobody felt safe. Nobody wanted to admit what they thought, that whoever had killed Jodi had done it with rage. Rage sharp enough to slash and stab again and again until the act became almost inhuman. And yet, as the police examined the scene, one thing became clear. Whoever had done it had known the path. The killer had chosen that place deliberately. Hidden, quiet, familiar. A place where Jodi might have felt safe, but where no one would hear her scream. Back at the station, detectives stared at the map of the area, tracing her last walk with shaking pens. There was something unbearably intimate about the crime. Whoever had done this hadn't just killed Jodi Jones. They had wanted her to suffer. They had wanted to leave a mark, not just on her body, but on the entire community. Meanwhile, her family's home had become a hollow shell. Curtains pulled tight. Phones ringing off the hook. Strangers leaving flowers outside the door, their footsteps quickening as they hurried away, as if lingering too long might invite whatever horror had found Jodi to notice them too. It was supposed to be just another autumn evening, just another walk, but the reality of it was spreading now, seeping into every corner of Dalkeith. Jodi's killer wasn't some phantom in the woods. They were real, human breathing. And they weren't finished, not yet. Because the more the police looked, the more they realized this murder wasn't random. It was personal, and whoever had done it was close. Luke Mitchell's name surfaced almost immediately, whispered behind closed doors before it was ever written in police notes. He was only a year older than Jodi, just 15 at the time, but their relationship had drawn attention long before her murder. He had that quiet, brooding presence, the kind of teenager who seemed to cultivate mystery like it was armor. To his friends, he was rebellious, cool, untouchable. To adults, he was unsettling. When detectives first questioned him, Luke said he hadn't been with Jodi that evening. He claimed he'd been home, smoking cannabis in his garden shed, waiting for her to visit. But his alibi was thin, just him and his older brother, Shane, who backed up the story. There was no clock-in punch, no shop receipt, no neutral witness. Just words. The police weren't convinced. There was something about his demeanor, the way he looked them straight in the eye with a defiance most teenagers couldn't hold. When they asked him what Jodi had been wearing that night, he described her clothes with eerie precision. The black trousers, the t-shirt with a band logo, the zip-up hoodie. But here's the detail that chilled them. Luke described the pattern of her wristbands. Thin, colored rubber bands she always wore on her arm. The thing was, only someone who had seen her body that night could know how they were arranged. And the police hadn't released that information yet. Still, Dalkeith was divided. To some, Luke was just an easy target, the boyfriend scapegoat. Others muttered that his fascination with dark music, his obsession with bands like Marilyn Manson, was a bad sign. In 2003, that kind of imagery scared parents. Black clothes, eyeliner, lyrics that dripped with violence and despair. For some, it wasn't just fashion. It was a warning. The town buzzed with theories. In the cafes and the pubs, Luke's name came up again and again. Yet the more people whispered, the louder his friends defended him. He was just different, they said. Just another teenager trying to stand out in a small place where everyone expected you to fit in. But the police kept circling back to him. They retraced Jodi's last walk, step by step, with Luke at their side. And here's where it got unnerving. When the group reached the old stone wall and climbed through to the path, Luke didn't hesitate. He led the officers along as though he knew the way, his stride sure, his eyes sharp. Then, without being told, he stopped at a spot by the wall, pointed down into the brush, and said, "This is where she'll be." The officers exchanged a look. That phrase stuck with them, cold and heavy. This is where she'll be. Not might be, not maybe here. He spoke with certainty, as if he'd already been there. And when they pushed through the brambles, there she was. Exactly where Luke had pointed. Exactly where she had been left. The hairs on the back of one detective's neck stood up. This wasn't just a coincidence. It felt like a confession, even if Luke hadn't meant it that way. But at 15 years old, could a boy really commit something so brutal? Could he be capable of the kind of rage that tore Jodi's life apart in the most vicious way? The police weren't sure yet. But Dalkeith was no longer a town, just grieving a murdered girl. It was a town divided between those who thought the killer was already among them, and those who thought evil had no age limit. The weeks that followed were like a storm brewing over Dalkeith. The grief for Jodi hadn't gone anywhere. It lingered in every classroom, every hallway, every whispered conversation. But layered on top of it now was suspicion, sharp and poisonous. And the name on everyone's lips was Luke Mitchell. At first, it was just murmurs, passed quietly between adults after school meetings or whispered in the aisles of corner shops. But soon it became impossible to ignore. Parents forbade their daughters from walking alone, and some even warned them to stay away from Luke altogether. His very presence seemed to darken a room. The police investigation only fed the tension. Luke's house was searched, not once, but multiple times. Officers combed through his bedroom, his notebooks, his CD collection. They pulled clothing from his drawers, looking for fibers, bloodstains, anything that could connect him to the crime. His mother, Corinne, was fiercely protective, insisting her son was innocent. She said the police were targeting him unfairly, twisting his personality into something monstrous. But the community wasn't so sure. And then there was the dog search. Police handlers brought trained cadaver dogs to Luke's property. The dogs were supposed to sniff out traces of human blood or decomposition. In Luke's garden shed, the place he claimed to have been smoking cannabis the night Jodi died, the dogs reacted strongly. They pawed, barked, their noses pressed to the wood as if something invisible still clung to the walls. Word of that spread through Dalkeith like wildfire. To the people already suspicious of Luke, it was confirmation. Something had happened in that shed. Something bad. To others, it was just another layer of confusion. If there was evidence, why hadn't the police arrested him? Why were they dragging this out? But here's the thing that unsettled everyone most. Even as suspicion grew, Luke himself never seemed rattled. He walked through the streets with his head held high, sometimes with his arm around another girl, sometimes with that same blank, unreadable expression. Some saw it as confidence, the kind of calm only an innocent person could have. Others saw it as chilling, a mask of control hiding something darker. And then came the stories about his fascination with knives. Friends whispered about the blades he carried, how he liked to show them off, how he handled them with a strange kind of reverence. It was the kind of detail that, in hindsight, made everyone's stomach twist. The police were under immense pressure. The newspapers had caught hold of the case, splashing Jodi's photo across the front pages, painting Dalkeith as a town haunted by a teenage killer. Reporters lingered outside the school gates, thrusting microphones at anyone willing to talk. And in the middle of it all was Luke, a teenager who was either grieving a girlfriend he didn't kill, or carefully hiding the truth about what he'd done. Dalkeith was no longer safe. It was no longer small. It was a town under siege, its secrets dragged into the light, its people forced to wonder if evil had been sitting beside them all along. And as Halloween approached in 2003, the atmosphere grew even heavier. The holiday that usually brought costumes and laughter now felt wrong. Parents refused to let their children roam the streets. Pumpkins rotted on doorsteps, unlit. There was no appetite for celebration in a town still reeling from a murder. For many, it was as if the mask had slipped from Dalkeith itself. Behind the quaint houses and cobbled streets, something sinister had always been waiting. And now, with Jodi gone, it had finally stepped out into the open. The strangest thing about Luke wasn't what he said. It was what he didn't say. In the weeks after Jodi's death, when most teenagers his age might have been crumbling under grief, Luke barely seemed to crack. He attended vigils with that same emotionless stare, his jaw set, his eyes cold. People whispered that he never shed a tear, not once. It unsettled everyone. Teachers noticed it. Even his closest friends admitted later that something about him felt off. It wasn't just the lack of emotion, though. It was the way he carried himself, as if the tragedy circling around him didn't touch him at all. Some classmates said he almost seemed to thrive on the attention. Every headline, every whispered rumor at school, every side-eyed glance from the townsfolk. It was as if he enjoyed being the center of the storm. The police interviews only deepened the unease. Officers described Luke as calm, almost too calm, answering questions without hesitation, but with an edge of defiance. He stuck to his alibi, repeating that he'd been home, smoking cannabis in the shed, while Jodi walked to meet him. He claimed he had no idea what had happened to her until later that night. But then came the inconsistencies. The way he slipped up on small details, the exact time he was in the shed, the order of his phone calls, the gaps that no one could explain. And still, the most haunting thing wasn't the words, it was the silence. Luke didn't plead for help to find Jodi's killer. He didn't beg the town to clear his name. He didn't show the raw, desperate grief people expected. Instead, he seemed to fold into himself, quiet, closed off, almost daring people to believe the worst about him. For the community, that silence was louder than any confession. People started to view him through the lens of fear. Mothers whispered to their children to stay away from him. Fathers kept a watchful eye whenever Luke passed their homes. And the teenagers at Dalkeith High began spinning their own stories in hushed voices, painting him as a monster who'd hidden in plain sight. One girl recalled how Luke used to talk about Marilyn Manson, how he scribbled disturbing lyrics in his notebooks, how he carried his knives like they were an extension of himself. Others remembered dark conversations late at night when he spoke casually about violence as if it were nothing. At the time, those moments had seemed like posturing, teenage bravado. But in the wake of Jodi's murder, they became something else entirely, pieces of a puzzle no one wanted to finish. And the puzzle wasn't just about Luke. It was about Dalkeith itself, the uneasy realization that the darkness that stole Jodi wasn't an outside force, some nameless stranger lurking in the shadows. It might have been one of their own, a boy they'd seen every day, a neighbor, a friend. That thought clung to the town like fog. Every time Luke walked down the street, people wondered, were they staring at a grieving boyfriend, or at a killer who hadn't yet slipped. Halloween passed that year without joy. The children stayed home, the streets empty, the carved pumpkins left unlit. Parents said it was respect for Jodi. But in private, they admitted it was fear. A bone-deep fear that the mask of innocence had already been ripped away, and what stared back was something far more terrifying. And Luke, silent, cold, unreadable, was at the center of it all. The walls began closing in. By November, just days after Halloween passed like a shadow over Dalkeith, the police intensified their focus on Luke Mitchell. The case was no longer an open-ended mystery. It was narrowing, the spotlight burning hotter and hotter on a boy who had just turned 15. Detectives called him back in for questioning, over and over again. Each time, he sat with the same blank expression, insisting on the same alibi. He had been in the shed, smoking cannabis, when Jodi was murdered. But the more he repeated it, the less it sounded like the truth. Witnesses contradicted him. Timelines shifted. And still Luke never wavered. The police tore apart his life. They searched his home again, this time more aggressively, rifling through drawers, emptying closets, lifting floorboards. They scrutinized his schoolwork, his doodles in the margins, his journals filled with dark scribbles and references to violence. They examined the knives he collected, the polished steel blades he liked to show off to his friends. The officers weren't just looking for evidence. They were looking for motive. And slowly, pieces began to emerge. Tiny fragments, each disturbing on its own. But when placed together, they painted a picture no one wanted to look at. Luke's fascination with the macabre was well known at school. He worshipped Marilyn Manson, quoting lyrics that spoke of chaos, blood, and death. He doodled in notebooks with imagery that made teachers uneasy: skulls, blades, twisted faces. Classmates whispered that he carried knives not for protection, but for pleasure. And then there were the conversations, dark jokes about killing, fantasies about violence that seemed to spill out a little too easily. Individually, these details could have been brushed off as teenage rebellion, the angsty interests of a boy trying too hard to be edgy. But in the shadow of Jodi's murder, they became something else, red flags waving furiously. The most chilling part, though, wasn't what Luke did. It was how he reacted. Neighbors remembered how, in the days after Jodi's death, he didn't collapse in grief. He didn't cry. He didn't retreat. Instead, he walked the streets with his head held high, his long hair falling over his face, wearing his black trench coat like armor. Some said he smirked when people whispered about him. Others swore he enjoyed the attention, as if being feared gave him power. The police saw it too. They watched as he stonewalled every interrogation, his voice steady, his answers cold. He was 15, but he spoke like someone older, someone hardened. And the question kept echoing. How could a boy barely into his teens carry himself with such defiance in the face of so much suspicion? Unless he truly had something to hide. Dalkeith, once a town where doors were left unlocked, was now a place of whispers and locked windows. Parents kept their children closer. Teenagers traded rumors in the dark, their stories more frightening than any ghost tale. And through it all, Luke Mitchell walked among them, silent and untouchable. The fear wasn't just about what had already happened to Jodi. It was about what might happen next. If Luke had done it once, could he do it again? The police were certain the answer was yes. The town wasn't so sure. But either way, Dalkeith would never look at Halloween, or at Luke, the same way again. By early 2004, Dalkeith was no longer simply living with grief. It was living with the weight of accusation. And that weight finally tipped when Luke Mitchell was charged with the murder of Jodi Jones. The arrest didn't shock the town as much as you'd expect. For months, everyone had been circling his name, whispering behind closed doors. When the news broke that Luke was officially the suspect, it felt less like a revelation and more like confirmation of what many already feared. Still, hearing it announced out loud, hearing that a boy of 15 could have committed something so brutal, sent a chill that never really left. The courtroom became the new stage for Dalkeith's nightmare. Families packed the gallery, reporters lined the benches, their pens scratching furiously across notepads. Every word, every glance, every detail was dissected. And there at the center of it all was Luke. He didn't sit hunched or ashamed. He didn't look broken, like a teenager caught up in something too big for him. He sat upright, calm, staring straight ahead as if the trial wasn't about him at all. The prosecution painted a chilling picture. They spoke of Jodi's final walk, of how Luke lured her down that narrow path. They described the brutal attack, the calculated cruelty, the deliberate way the body had been hidden behind a wall. They presented his knives, his writings, his fascination with violence. Piece by piece, they laid out their case, and the horror of it clung to every word. But the defense had its own story. They insisted there was no forensic evidence linking Luke to the crime. No blood, no fingerprints, nothing concrete. They argued that the police had built their entire case on character assassination, twisting the image of a rebellious teenager into that of a killer. They said Luke's interests in dark music and knives were not evidence of murder. They were just the obsessions of a boy trying to find his identity in a world that didn't understand him. The trial dragged on for months, and in that time, Dalkeith split down the middle. Some saw Luke as a monster, guilty beyond question. Others whispered about the possibility of a frame-up, of a rush to judgment that had stolen a boy's future. Families argued over dinner tables, friendships cracked under the strain, the community tearing itself apart just as brutally as the crime itself had torn into Jodi's family. And the most unnerving part was Luke himself. Every day, he walked into that courtroom with the same composure. No tears, no breakdowns, no visible fear. Some said it was arrogance, the smugness of someone who thought he could outsmart everyone. Others said it was emptiness, the hollow shell of a boy too numb to feel. Either way, it unsettled everyone. Because whether Luke Mitchell was innocent or guilty, one thing was certain: Dalkeith would never be the same again. And as the trial stretched on, one question grew louder in the town's collective mind. Was justice truly closing in, or was something darker slipping through the cracks of the system? The day of the verdict felt like the entire town of Dalkeith was holding its breath. Outside the High Court in Edinburgh, crowds gathered behind barricades, their faces pale in the cold Scottish air. Some clutched newspapers with Jodi's picture on the front. Others just stood silently, waiting for the words that would either confirm their fears or plunge them into even deeper uncertainty. Inside, the courtroom was tense, every creak of the wooden benches echoing like a gunshot. The jury had spent hours deliberating, weighing the absence of forensic evidence against the mountain of circumstantial details. The alibi that didn't hold up, the dogs reacting in the shed, the knives, the drawings, the cold demeanor. When Luke entered the room, he carried himself the same way he always had, calm, controlled, eyes steady. He sat down at the defense table, his long hair falling into his face, and folded his hands in his lap as if he were waiting for nothing more serious than a school exam result. That composure unnerved everyone. People wanted to see fear. They wanted to see guilt. But all they got was that same unreadable mask. The silence was suffocating when the foreman stood. Guilty. The word cracked through the air like thunder. In the gallery, gasps and muffled sobs broke out. Jodi's family clung to one another, their grief twisting into something sharper, justice, or at least the closest thing to it they would ever get. On the other side of the room, Luke's mother collapsed in tears, her cries echoing against the stone walls. She shouted that her son was innocent, that the jury had been poisoned by lies, but her words were drowned out by the weight of the verdict. Luke himself didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He simply sat there, motionless, as if the word had rolled off him without meaning. His expression never changed. And that, more than the verdict itself, sent a deeper chill through the room. Because guilty or innocent, the boy sitting there seemed carved from stone. The judge handed down a life sentence, with a minimum of 20 years before parole. Luke Mitchell, just 16 years old by then, was led away in handcuffs. Reporters outside scrambled to deliver the breaking news, their cameras flashing, their voices filling the cold air. Dalkeith, the quiet town that had once been known for nothing more than its history and its modest streets, was now marked forever by a murder, a trial, and a name that would never be forgotten. And yet, even as the verdict settled, even as the headlines declared justice served, there was a lingering unease. Some whispered that the police had never proven their case, that the jury had convicted Luke not on evidence, but on fear. Others insisted the verdict was right, that the mask had finally been ripped away. But in the end, one truth haunted everyone: Jodi Jones was still gone. And the horror of what had happened to her, on that quiet summer night, would never truly leave Dalkeith. The trial ended, the courtroom emptied, and the cameras went home. To most of the world, Jodi's murder became just another tragic headline. But in Dalkeith, and especially in the Jones family's home, the horror never ended. You can change the locks, you can repaint the walls, you can even tear down a tree, but you can't scrub out the sound of footsteps that shouldn't be there, or the feeling that someone is standing just out of sight. People said justice had been done, but others whispered in pubs and around kitchen tables that something didn't feel right. Not just about the case, but about the way the air still seemed heavy, even years later, whenever you walked near the path where Jodi died. There was no Halloween that passed without her name surfacing in hushed conversations, like a curse no one wanted to say out loud. And that's the part one can't shake. The idea that once a place absorbs something that violent, that cruel, it doesn't let it go. You can pave it, you can grow grass over it, but deep down, it's still there. Sometimes, when people in Dalkeith walk their dogs at night, they swear they see a girl, just ahead of them, slipping through the trees. Long hair swaying, just out of reach. And when they quicken their pace, when they try to call out, she's gone. Nothing but the sound of wind moving through the branches. Maybe it's just grief, given shape by the mind. Or maybe Jodi Jones never really left that path. Maybe the violence was so intense, so abrupt, that part of her is still out there, replaying those final minutes over and over again, waiting for someone to notice, someone to listen. I think about that whenever Halloween comes around. Not the costumes, not the candy, not the laughter echoing down suburban streets. No, I think about the path in Midlothian, dark and silent, where the trees seem to lean in just a little too close, where the air turns cold even when the wind is still. And if you ever find yourself in Dalkeith, if you're walking alone on a chilly October night, and you hear something behind you, soft, hesitant footsteps, don't turn around. Because some doors, once opened, can never be shut again.